How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Daf 29 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, great daf here, Daf 29. It's going to be, let's see, what's it going to be? Yeah, it's going to be a bit of a daf. It's going to be, yeah, yeah, that kind of a daf. I feel it's going to be a long one because we also have some work to do from yesterday. But, well, not from, from Chavches. Anyways, if and when half can be considered more than half. Very interesting discussion. We see a machlekes between Rav and Rav Kahana about whether mechza al mechza kirov dami, whether when something is 50%, if it could actually be considered like a majority. Pretty interesting question. That's going to be so that's going to be the first section of today's daf. Interesting question there. The second of three sections on today's daf, when slicing more than half is sufficient, right? Exactly. In our Mishnah, of course, the first Mishnah of the second parak of Masechta Chullin, we had said both in the Reisha and in the Seifa that more than half, right? That rove, the slicing rove of a siman is sufficient. So we are going to discuss why say it twice. What's it talking about in the Reisha? What's it talking about in the Seifa? And finally, when shechita begins technically, this is actually it's reminiscent of a discussion that we had when it comes to schirus, right? There's a discussion of ein l'schirus el vasof or yesh l'schirus mitchila va'ad sof. Anyways, this is the discussion we have, but with shechita, the shaila of is the shechita, does it begin from the beginning of the slice until the completion of the slice or of the slicing? Or is it considered that the shechita happens when the shechita is complete, but not before then? We're going to discuss nafkamina. So, it's a daf that we're going to fall in love with, and in a very deep way. And because we're gonna really have to get involved. It's a Gemara-y kind of daf, which is great. So come join me. Let's enjoy ourselves. Let's have a great time. Let's study daf Chavtes of Masechta Chullin. Okay, so as I mentioned, we have some work to do. We have some stuff to learn on Daf Ches Amid Beis. So we are going to begin about 5 or 6 lines before it gets wide on Daf Ches Amid Beis, where it says Chatzi Echad Ba'of V'chulei. The Mishnah had said, let's see, what did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah had said Chatzi Echad Ba'of. I'm reading from the Mishnah on Daf Chav Zayin Amud Aleph, that if one slices 50% of the way through one of the simanim for a bird, or ve'echad v'chetzi ba'behema, or through 1.5 of the simanim by a behema. In both of those cases, psula, was it shchitasen psula technically? What does it say? Verbatim. Shchitasu psula. It's a pasul shchita. Why? Because you have to have at least rove. Well, for a bird, you have to have rove of 1 siman. For an animal, you have to have rove of 2 simanim. Therefore, 50% is not enough. It has to be more than 50%. So now that leads us to the following interesting machlokas. Idmar, it was stated, Rav Amar says, Rav, mechza al mechza kirov, Rav Kahana Amar mechza al mechza eno kirov. Machlokes Rav and Rav Kahana. Rav says that mechza al mechza is kirov, so in our case, we're going to assume what it means, is that we're going to assume. Basically, at the end, we're going to say, I'm going to spill the beans. At the end, we're going to say that it's actually not talking about shechita, but that's only at the end. Until then, we're assuming that it's talking about shechita, okay? So I'm going to talk about it in terms of shechita. So what Rav is saying is that essentially, if you slice, so let's say for a bird, you slice halfway through one of the simanim, Rav would say that is enough, because half is considered like a majority. Whereas if Kahana disagrees and he says, it's not. It's simply not a majority. It's half. Again, Idmar was stated, Rav Omar says, Rav, mechza al mechza kirov, that 50% can be treated like a majority. Rav Kahana Omar, whereas Rav Kahana says, mechza mechza eno kirov, 50% cannot be treated like a majority. Rav Omar says, Rav, mechza al mechza kirov, that 50% can be treated like a majority. Hachi Omar le Rachmana le Moshe, what the Rabban Shalom says to Moshe Rabbeinu is, lo tishayir ruba. Okay, so essentially what the Rabban Shalom said to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai with regard to shechita is, make sure, according to Rab, that when you slice, make sure that what remains unsliced is less than a majority. And therefore, if you slice 50% of the way through. What's left is 50%. 50% is not a majority. So the Rebbeinu Shalom tells Moshe Rabbeinu that make sure that when you're slicing, that if you're not going to slice the whole thing, make sure that whatever remains unsliced is less than a majority. And therefore 50% is sufficient. Rav Kahana Amar Mechza Mechza Eino Kirov Achi Amar Le Rachmana LeMoshe Shchot Ruba. Whereas Rav Kahana says that what the Rebbeinu Shalom instructed Moshe Rabbeinu is slice more than half of the siman, right? Make sure that when you're slicing, go at least a little bit more than 50%. Okay, so Rav says that half is enough. Half could be considered like more than half. Rav Kahana says half is simply half. It's not enough. Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah, Chatzi Echad Ba'of, that if one slices through half of a siman for a bird, ve'echad v'chetzi bebehema, or merely 1.5, but not more than that extra half, right? Meaning one full siman, sure, but the other one is only half, not more than that. Bebehema, by an animal, shechita so psula. Our Mishnah says it's insufficient, which is going to be a challenge for Rav, who says that it is sufficient. The Amrat mechza al mechza kirov. Now, according to you, Rav, that halfway is like a majority of the way. Amai pasula over le ruba. Well, according to Rav, why would our Mishnah say that the shechita is psula when you only slice 50%? According to Rav, 50% is like a majority. So as far as Rav is concerned, he sliced a majority of the way through the siman. What's the problem with that? And for the Gemara, well, Rav would say, midirabanon dumlo asi lemebod palge. Rav would say, the Mishnah is being machmir. Rav would say, look, mida oraise, if you slice 50% of the way through one of the simanim for a bird, let's say, it's enough. Mechza kirov. It's enough. Now, the Mishnah is being abundantly cautious because, look, let's be honest, it's hard to know exactly what 50% is. And if you're going exactly for 50%, you may end up with less than 50%, and that's going to be puzzle. So therefore, midrabanan, the rabbi said, don't slice just 50%. But says Rav, I'm telling you, midoraisa 50% is enough. We'll treat it like more than 50%. Amar Rav Katina, says Rav Katina, Tashma Kamanir, Chelko lishnayim vein shavin shnein tmeim lefisha yefshel etzamtzim. Very interestingly, Aitaka learned this in Mishnayos Masechta Kelim yesterday. I'm going to take a shluck of water and I'm going to tell you all about Masechta Kelim. So I was learning yesterday Mishnayos Masechta Kelim, Perek Hey Mishnah Vav. And there the Mishnah discusses how a toner, an oven, a clay oven, an earthenware oven that is tameh. So how do you make it tahor? You break it. And if you break it, it becomes tahor. So what's considered broken? So the Mishnah says you split it in 3. And by splitting it in 3, if you split into 3 equal parts, so then each part is only a third of the whole, and i.e. no part is 50%. They're all, it's considered small enough pieces, it's considered broken, and it's no longer tummy. It's now tahor. Now, the Mishnah there says, in Masechta Kelim, that if you break the oven in 2, and you have one part is bigger than the other, so the smaller part, which is going to be less than half of the oven, so the smaller part is tahor, but the larger part, which is more than half of the oven, is tameh. Now, so essentially, if either part is more than half, it's going to be tameh. So now what we're saying here is, chelko l'shnayim, if you have a tanur, if you have an oven that's tameh, and you break it into 2 pieces, vein shavin, even if they're, as far as you could tell, equal, nonetheless, shneim tmein, both of them are tmein lefi, because she'yefshel etzamtzim, it's impossible to be literally 50-50. It's one of them is bound to be a little bit bigger than the other, and if to your eye they look equal, so then you can't tell which one is the bigger one, in which case you have to be concerned that each one could be the bigger one, and therefore we have to treat them both as though they are, we have to treat each as though they are the bigger one, i.e., we have to say that each one is tameh, remains tameh. Because we have to be concerned that each one is the larger one. However, that's only out of the concern that it can't be exactly halfway. But if you can somehow know that it's literally 50-50, so tahorin, well then it would be tahor. Right? So it says the Brisa, the only reason why, right, the Brisa says you break it in two, even if it looks like 50-50, they're both tameh, because it can't be that they're both 50-50. But implying that if you could somehow be 1,000% sure that it was broken in two equal halves, it would be tahor. But one second, what about Rav? Amai. Why should they both be tahor? Amai tahor and zil acha ikaruba, zil acha ikaruba. According to Rav, if mechza is kirov, that 50% is like more than 50%, well then, even in the scenario where you manage to have perfect halves, great, but we're going to consider each half like it's more than half, which would make it still tameh. So why would we imply that if you can make it two perfect halves, then they would be tahor, but we would have to treat them in Meila like they're more than half, in which case they would still be tameh anyways. So Rav Papa says, Rav Papa, Trei Rube Bechad Mana Leka. Says Rav Papa, look, we could say mechza kirov when we're only looking kind of at one piece of the puzzle. If you have 100% of the trachea, let's say, and you slice through halfway, and we'll say, you know what, we're going to consider the halfway like it's more than halfway. Great, but we're not measuring the unsliced part, right? It's like nothing needs to add up to 100, is the point, right? You can't have two halves of an oven that are both more than 50%. It has to add up to 100%. So if we're only looking at like one piece, let's say, and we're saying, okay, we're going to treat half like it's more than half, and we're not, and the second piece we're not calculating, so we say that we'll treat one half like it's more than half. And therefore, when it comes to shechita, even if you slice 50% of the way exactly, we'll treat it like more than half. Okay, great. But if you're dividing an oven in two, and now you have two pieces, and we're saying each piece is more than half, then at this point it becomes impossible. You can't have two pieces of the same thing each be more than half. That's just impossible, right? Once already they have to add up to 100. Then we can't say that both halves are more than a half. Again, so Amar Papa says, Papa Trei Rube Bechad Mana Leka. You can't have two rows with one. For one piece, that's impossible. To say that one piece will treat like it's more than half is fine, but to say that two pieces are both more than half is simply impossible. We can't do it. Tashma, come in here. Now we're going to quote two brises that we learned about yesterday. Interestingly, we are actually going to define them inversely, right, in the opposite way that we defined them yesterday. The first one being Tashma Shachat Chatzi Gargeres. If a fellow sliced through, now we're assuming now that this is talking about an animal. If a person sliced through half of the trachea, Visha ba kidei shechita, and then he took a break for enough time that he could have slaughtered another animal, enough time that, of course, there are 5 psulim when it comes to shechita. One of them is shehiyah. If you wait too long in the middle of shechita, he sliced through halfway through the trachea, and then he takes a break enough time that generally it would be considered shehiyah. Vigamra, and then he comes back and he finishes the shechita. Nonetheless, shechita so ksher. So we're assuming that we're talking about an animal as opposed to a bird, and he sliced halfway through the trachea, and then he took a break. And he came back and finished up the shechita. He then, sliced through the rest of the trachea, sliced through at least half of the esophagus, and he finished up the shechita properly. Now, that works if you say that half is half. So he sliced through half of the trachea, which is fine. The half of the trachea won't make it a treifa. So that's fine. And then he came back and he finished up the shechita. That's fine. But if you say that half is like more than half, well then when he initially sliced through half of the trachea, he made it a treifa. And if he's not going to immediately finish up with the shechita and also slice through the esophagus and complete the shechita, well then it's going to be possible b'shehiyah. Right? If you're going to say like Rab, mechza kirov, that half is like a majority, and therefore when you slice through half of the trachea, it's ki'ilu you try to slice through a majority of the trachea, and now it's a treifa, itarfa lo, it's a treifa. So the Gemara answers, misavrat bebehema. Wait, do you think that it's talking about a behema? Lo, be'of. No. It's talking about a bird. And therefore, mimon afshach. Mechza kirov. If it's like Rab, that mechza, right? All good either way. If it's like Rab, that mechza is kirov, well then, a bird where you only need to slice through one siman, by slicing halfway, it's like you slice through most of the trachea, and that's a kosher shechita. All good. So you have majority and it's a proper shechita. And if mechza is only halfway, well, lo avad v'lo klum. Well, slicing half of it it's fine because it won't make it a treifa. Wait as long as you want. It's not a treifa. Come back whenever you want and finish slicing. All good. So either way, if you say mechza is kirov, so the initial slice was a kosher shechita. If you say that it's not kirov, well then, okay, great, no big deal. You'll take a break and you'll come back later and finish the shechita, and it is all good. Now, if you remember yesterday, we quoted this braise. If you remember yesterday, we quoted this braise in the other way around, right? Yesterday, we brought this braise as a kasha against Rav Kahana, who says that when it comes to shechita of a bird, you dafka need to slice through the esophagus. And we brought this as a raya that no, you could be slicing just to the trachea, and they say no, this is talking about an animal, it's not talking about a bird. Here we're saying the opposite, it's talking about dafka a bird. And we're going to see the same thing now as well. Tashma kamanir haresh oya chatzi kana pagum. Right? If you remember this from yesterday, if he goes to slaughter a bird, and it turns out that half of the kana, that half of the trachea is already broken. V'osif olav kosher, and he just adds a shtickle slice. V'gamer, when he completes the shechita su kshera. It is a kosher shechita. V'amrat mechza kirov treif avya. Now, if it's like Rav is saying that mechza is kirov, so when you find that this bird, the trachea was already halfway broken, well then it's considered like it was most of the way broken, which means that it's a treifa. You can't slaughter a treifa and make that kosher. No. So how's Rav going to explain this? Right, you have this bird, its trachea is already half broken. And we're saying nishgeferloch, half broken is not a treifa, so you could just slice a little bit more and all good. But if you say like Rab, that half is like more, well then it's more than halfway broken, in which case it's a treifa. How can you make a kosher shechita there? Omar Rove says Rove shiny linen treifa. 1 second. We're talking about treifas here. Dibainan rov anir leinayim. When it comes to a treifa, you need a rov that is visibly identifiable. Then when it comes to treifas, but when it comes to treifas, you're not just simply going to say that half is like a rov. You need an obviously identifiable rov. And therefore, we're not going to apply the concept of half is like a majority when it comes to treifas. And therefore, if you find that the trachea was already half broken, it's not going to be considered a treifa since it's only 50%, and you can just go weiter in the shechita and all good. But now Abaye says, 1 second. So you're telling me that when it comes to treifas, and we're talking about halfway in the context of a treifa, it needs to be, or really majority when it comes to a treifa, it needs to be a visible majority. Abaye says, okay, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that, but something is not adding up. What's not adding up? Abaye says to Rava, "V'lo kol dechenu." But if that's the case, then certainly umatrefa. If when it comes to a treifa, dibimashu mitarfa, that there are scenarios where by treifas, even the smallest hole is going to make a treifa. For example, the esophagus. A tiny little hole in the esophagus, treifa. So if when it comes to treifa, where there are scenarios where even the tiniest little hole will make it a treifa, and yet there are other scenarios where you need a majority, for example, by the trachea, right? So by the esophagus, even a tiny little hole will make it a treifa. By the trachea, you need a majority. And ba'inan ruba, and by the trachea, where we say that we need that majority, ba'inan rov hanira le'naim, we need not just a little majority, we need a major majority, a visibly identifiable majority. So if when it comes to treifas, where there is a particularly stringent angle there, that when it comes to the esophagus, even the smallest hole will make it a treifa, and yet when it comes to the trachea, where we need a majority, we need a clearly visible majority. So then, shechita da'di'ika ruba lo miskashra, well then certainly when it comes to shechita, where you always need a majority, there's no such thing as like a small little cut will be a proper shechita. You always need a majority. You always need at least a majority. Well then, lo kol shekein debinan rov hanira le'naim, certainly then by shechita, you're going to need a visibly identifiable and confirmable majority. If by treifas, when we talk about majority, you need a clearly identifiable majority, well then certainly by shechita, when we talk about majority, you're going to need a clearly identifiable majority. So therefore, what is the deal with Rav? Why does Rav say that even 50% could be considered like a majority? Wouldn't you need a visibly identifiable majority? So rather, when it comes to shechita, this machlokes does not apply. When it comes to shechita, everyone agrees 50% is not a rov. 50% is not enough by shechita. It's going to have to be more than that. V'chi itmar derab v'derav kahana linyan pesach itmar. The machlokes between Rav and Rav Kahana about whether we can consider half to be a rov or not is in a different context. It's by this week's parsha, Pesach Sheni. Pesach Sheni comes up in Shlishi, in the third aliyah of this week's parsha, Parshas Ba'aloscha, Pesach Sheni. And it says, when by the Korban Pesach, right, by individuals, if you have an individual who is tamei or is far enough away that he be whatever. Rashi Taka says something interesting. Rashi on the Chumash says that far away just means that you're outside of the Yazara. That's not very far away, and it's enough. Akoponim. Shita of Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah in Masechta Pesachim. Akoponim. Al-Koponim. An individual who's essentially, let's say, unable to offer the Pesach Rishon, so he can offer the Pesach Sheni. But we say that if the majority of Am Yisrael is Timei Meis, so then as if a majority of Am Yisrael is Timei Meis, Am Yisrael can offer the Pesach Rishon, right? Individuals are Nidchet to Pesach Sheni, but if a majority of Am Yisrael is Timei Meis, they can offer the Pesach Rishon. Right? An individual does Pesach Sheni, but a majority of Am Yisrael would do Pesach Rishon. So Areish you saw Mechza Tarim Mechza Tameim. What if it's a 50-50 split? Rav Omer Mechza Amechza Kirov. Rav says we'll treat them like a majority, and therefore they can do Pesach Rishon. Rav Kahana Omer Mechza Amechza Eino Kirov. Whereas Rav Kahana says no, we won't treat 50-50 like a majority, and they will have to do Pesach Sheni. Also, my time of the Rav, why does Rav say that we'll treat them like a rov? Because the pasuk says, Ish ki tomei lo nefesh. Because it says by Pesach Sheni, if you have an individual fellow who is Tmei Meis, Ish nidched vein tzibur nidched. It's an individual who does Pesach Sheni, but not the entire congregation. What does Rashi say? Rashi says, Dichsiv ish ki tomei yidochet l'sheni ufalga nehid deruba lo mikre. And when you have half of Am Yisrael, granted it's not a majority, but miu michlal yichidin nafkilu v'lo mitku. But 50% is no longer individuals. Sure, it might not be a majority, but it's no longer individuals either. I'm going to take a slurp of water. Okay, so that is where the machlokes between Rav and Rav Kahana is whether we'll consider a 50% to be a majority. That is specifically by Pesach Sheni. Rav would say if you have 50% of Am Yisrael is Tamei Meis, they can do Pesach Rishon because they would no longer be considered. It's beyond the scope of ish of individuals. Once you have 50% of Am Yisrael, then they would not do Pesach Sheni. They would do Pesach Rishon B'Tomah. Friends, now we move on to the next section of Daf Chav Tes of Masechta Chullin. When slicing more than half is sufficient, really, what are the contexts in which we say that rov of the siman is sufficient? Let's see what we're talking about. Rov echad ba'of. So the Mishnah had said that slicing through rov siman echad, through just one siman by a bird, is sufficient. By an animal, you would have to slice through at least half of both simanim, to a majority of both simanim. Tanino chadazimna. Oh, so Frag the Gemara knew. Let's flip back to the Mishnah again. I'm going to read the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, "Ashechet echad ba'ov v'shtayim b'beim mishchitos u'ksher v'rubo shel echad kamo." The Mishnah says that a majority, slicing through a majority of the siman, it's like you slice through the whole thing, all good. And then if we jump to the end of the Mishnah, what does it say at the end of the Mishnah? Rov echad ba'ov v'rov shnayim b'beim mishchitos u'ksher. A majority of one of the simanim by a bird, or a majority of both of the simanim by an animal, ksher. Why are we saying the same thing twice? That's what the Gemara wants to know. Makes sense. Why should the Mishnah repeat itself? Tanino chadazimna ni. We already taught this earlier in the Mishnah. Ruba shalechad kamo. That the majority of the siman is like the whole thing. Amr Voshaye says of Voshaye, chada b'chulim v'chada b'kachim. Oh. So it says, Abishai, I'll tell you the answer. The reason why the Mishnah says this halacha twice, that rubo kekulo essentially, is because once is in the context of chulin, the other is in the context of kodshin. V'tzricha, and we need the Mishnah to teach us about chulin and kodshin, because the ashminu chulin, if the Mishnah only said that by chulin rov is sufficient, well, hasamu desagi lebruba. Sure, rov is sufficient when it comes to chulin. Mishum delav lidam utzarich, because by chulin you don't need the blood. You need to shech the animal so you can eat it. The blood is a byproduct. You're not doing anything with it. Aval kodshim diladam utzarich, but by korbanos you do need the blood. The blood is really important. Ki adamu anet, right? Ki adamu, was it? Ki adamu b'nefesh yichaper, right? That the zrikas adam is the key element of a korban. Super important. So therefore, when it comes to kachim, where you mamish need the blood, so ema lo tizge le beruba adika kule. I might think that rov is not going to cut it when it comes to kachim. Since you mamish need the blood, you got to go the whole way when it comes to blood. Where did I see? Maybe it was in the Rambam that I think I saw in the Rambam that basically you slice through, like when it comes to korbanos, I think you slice through the simanim, and then you because you got to get them into the kli, right? You got to get them into the kli sharis, kabbalah sadam. So it's like a faucet. It's like a hose. Although I guess the blood isn't necessarily in the trachea and the esophagus, though. So maybe that doesn't necessarily make sense. Where's the blood come? I don't know. Yeah, what? Wait, that doesn't... I don't know, now I'm thinking about it differently, but I got the impression you slice through the trachea and the esophagus, then you take the trachea and the esophagus and they're like a hose that you stick into the vessel and empty out the blood into the vessel. But I imagine that the blood isn't coming out of the trachea and the esophagus. I imagine the blood is squirting out from somewhere else. But I guess maybe the point is you take wherever the blood is squirting out and you aim it into the klisharis. Anyways, fine. Where are we? So when it comes to korbanis, so since you need the blood is the key element almost, when it comes to a korban, maybe you'd have to slice the whole way. A simple majority is not going to cut it. And if we said that by kodshim, you need a majority, you need to slice at least a majority because you got to get that blood is important. Chulin where the blood is not important, maybe 50% is enough. Maybe you don't need a majority. Therefore, the Mishnah had to teach us about the majority twice, to say that a majority works for chulin and that a majority works for kodshim. Hey, b'chulin ve b'kodshim. Now, fleg the Gemara. Okay, fine, great. So the Mishnah is talking about chulin and kodshim. Which one's which? The first mention, right? The first time the Mishnah teaches you need a majority. What's that? Chulin or kodshim? Rav Kahana says of Kahana, mistavre reisha b'chulin v'sefer b'kodshim, says of Kahana that, I'll tell you, the reisha, the first part of the Mishnah, is talking about chulin, and the second time the rov is mentioned in the Mishnah, it's talking about kodshim. Now we're going to see essentially until the top of Chavtes Amud Beis, we're going to see several different. So first of all, as Rav Kahana just said, the reisha. Okay, I'm going to refer to the first time that we mention the majority of the slice. Right, you got to slice to a majority. I'm going to mention the first time as the reisha, and the second time we mention it as the seifa. So as Rav Kahana just said, the reisha is talking about chulin, and the seifa is talking about kodshim. Everyone agrees. All good. We're going to see several different supports for this notion. How do we know that the reisha is talking about chulin and the seifa is talking about kodshim? So says Rav Kahana, mistaver reisha b'chulin v'seifa b'kodshim, that the reisha is talking about chulin and the seifa is talking about kodshim because mimai, how do we know? Midikatone hashoichet, because what does the Mishnah say? It says hashoichet echad ba'of. Now, if the reisha were talking about kodshim, you wouldn't be talking about hashoichet echad ba'of. You'd be talking about hamoilik echad ba'of. Midikatone hashoichet, because it says in the reisha hashoichet echad ba'of, slaughtering. Clearly, we're talking about chulin. And if we're saying that the reisha was talking about kodshim, there is no shechita of a bird by kodshim. Hamolek miboile, it should say melika hamolek echad ba'of. So clearly, then we're not talking about kodshim. We're talking about chulin. Frag the Gemara elamai seifa b'kodshim. So are you telling me that the seifa therefore is talking about kodshim? Well, here's the thing. Shechita kshera, it says there also, shechita kshera. What does it say in the Mishnah? It says, rov echad ba'of, v'rov shnayim b'bema, shechita kshera. So there in the Sefer also talks about rov echad ba'of, and we're saying that it's talking about kodshim, and what does it conclude? Shechita kshera. It doesn't say milika kshera. So it might be Sefer b'kodshim, shechita kshera, milika kshera in Baile. It should say, in the Seifa also, it should mention Melika. If we're talking about Kodshim, the Seifa, it should mention Melika for birds, not Shechita for birds. Halo Kasha. The Gemara says, I'm not too concerned with that. Why? I did this Salik Mibei Matanam Shechita Ksher. Look, because in the Seifa, once again, what does it say in the Seifa? It says, Rov Echad Ba'of, V'rov Shnayim B'behema, Shechita Ksher. So, when we say shechita kshera, what came right before that? Rov shnayim b'behema. It's talking about behema, and then it mentions shechita. But if you look at the ratio, what does it say? Hashochet, and then immediately it talks first about echad ba'of. So therefore, right, in the ratio, the action, shechita / malika, in the ratio, the action is right next to the bird. Hashochet echad ba'of. V'shnayim b'behema. But it says shochet echad ba'of. Shochet is juxtaposed, is right next to oaf. And in the Seifa it says echad ba'of v'shnayim, right? Rov echad ba'of v'rov shnayim b'behema shchitaso ksher. So we have behema shchitaso ksher. So in the Seifa, shchita is right next to behema, and in the Reisha, shchita is right next to oaf. And therefore, the Reisha we're saying is talking about chulin, because if it was talking about kodshim, it would be weird to say ashochet echad ba'of when really if it was kachim, you'd have to do malika. So we said that the Sefer is talking about kachim. Now you're going to say, but it says shechita sukshir in the Sefer also. Yes, but that's only because it's coming right after behema, right? Rov echad ba'ov, v'rov shnayim behema shechita sukshir, because shechita in the Sefer is coming right after behema, so it says behema, but it is talking about kachim. And yes, technically when it comes to the bird, which came before that, shechita wouldn't be the right descriptor. Malika would be correct, but again, because it's coming right after behema, that's why it says shechita. So, I the salik mebehema, since I'm reading that again, since shechita sukshera is commenting on what was right before, or is really kind of coming right after behema. Tananam shechita sukshera, so it says shechita sukshera because you have shechita by behema. Ela reisha, but in the reisha where we're saying it's talking about chulin, michdei al ovkoi, the action is right next to birds. And if it was talking about kachim hamolek mibayle, it should really say hamolek. Therefore, it must be that the reisha is chulin and the seifa is kachim. Next, Rav Shimon bar Ashi Amar says Rav Shimon bar Ashi. Also, everyone agrees that the reisha is chulin, the seifa is kachim. We're just going to have different supports for this. Reisha b'chulin me'acha. We know that the reisha is talking about chulin from here. Dikatoni echad ba'ov, because it says one siman by an oaf, and if you think that it's talking about kachim, well then what about olas ha'of? Ha'ika olas ha'of debai shnei simanim. Olas ha'of requires two simanim. Echad ba'of would not make sense, right? Only requiring one siman for an oaf does not make sense if we're talking about kachim, because olas ha'of requires both of them. Elamai sefer b'kachim? No. We still have a question on the Sefer though. So you're telling me that Sefer is talking about kachim. Rov echad ba'of, when we say in the Sefer, Rov echad ba'of, ha'ika olas ha'of debai shnei simanim, don't we have the same question there? What about olas ha'of? It requires two simanim, not one. So my Rov echad, Rov kol echad ve'echad. No, in the Sefer, when we're saying Rov echad ba'of, it means Rov kol echad ve'echad, for each of them. And if we're talking about chatas ha'of, where all you need is one siman, so it means just that one. And if we're talking about olas ha'of, where it's talking about both simanim, so each of them. Uvedinu dilesne rov shnaim, and technically we could have said the majority of both of them, but kevan deika chatas the sakile b'chad siman mishamachi lo psikale. But because you have the chatas of which all you need is one siman, so you can't just say both simanim because that wouldn't work for chatas of. So we say each siman, and whether there's just one, so it'll be only that one, or whether there's two, it's each of the two. Rav Papa Amar says, Rav Papa Reisha b'chulin me'achad. This is how we know that the Reisha is talking about chulin. The Katani Reb Yehuda Omer ad sheyishchot es avridin uflig rabbanon ale. Says Rav Papa, we know that the Reisha is talking about chulin because Rabbi Yehuda says you have to slice through the veins as well to drain out the blood. And the rabbis, of course, argue on Rabbi Yehuda, right? This is the shechita of Rabbi Yehuda. The rabbis argue. Now, if this was talking about kachim, the rabbis wouldn't argue. Of course, when it comes to kachim, you need the blood, as much of it as you can get. So, of course, they would say slice the veins as well. So the fact that the rabbis argue means that it can't be talking about kachim, it must be talking about chulin. If we say that the Reisha is talking about chulin, givaldi. But if we say that the Reisha is talking about kachim, amai pligi rabbanon ole, why would the rabbis argue and say you don't need to slice the veins? Of course you need to slice the veins in order to get out the blood. After all, you need the blood of the korban. So the rabbis wouldn't argue with Rabbi Yehuda if we were talking about kachim. So clearly the fact that the rabbis argue, we must be talking about chulin. Rav Ashi Amar says Rav Ashi sefer b'kachim me'acha. Says Rav Ashi, we know that the sefer is talking about kachim from here. The katani hashoichet shnei roshim ke'echad shchitasu ikshera. That immediately after this Mishnah, the very next Mishnah, which is on Lamed Amid Beis, what does the Mishnah start? What's the ratio of the next Mishnah? Hashoichet beis roshim ke'echad shchitasu ikshera. That one who slices two Russian together, two heads together, so it's kosher. And Rav Ashi says that the next Mishnah essentially flows directly from the previous Mishnah. So the previous Mishnah ends with Rov Echad Ba'of, Rov Shnayim B'Beima, Shechita Kshera, and then immediately flows in to the next Mishnah, Asherchet Beis Roshin Ke'echad, Shechita Kshera. And there, in the next Mishnah, it's clearly talking about Kodshim. Why is it clearly talking about Kodshim? So again, Rav Ashi says, Rav Ashi, Sefer the Kodshim Me'acha, I'll prove to you that the Sefer is talking about Kodshim from here, the Katani, that the continuation of the Mishnah, the very beginning of the next Mishnah, is Ashoichet Shnei Roshin Ke'echad, that somebody who slices two Roshin at once, he slices two heads at once. He has a big knife and he slices two heads at once. Shchitasu Kshera, the Shchita is Kshera. Ashoichet Di'avidin L'chatchila lo. But the fact that he says Ashoichet, if he did this, it means it's only B'di'avid. It's not L'chatchila. So if we're saying that the next Mishnah is talking about Kodshim, okay, I get it. I understand why it's B'di'evid. Why L'chatchila you should have one person slaughtering one animal at a time. Mishum Titani Rav Yosef, that Rav Yosef taught, Tizbach, that when the Pasuk says, V'chi sizbachu zevach shlom la'Hashem le'tzonchem tizbachu, so Tizbach is singular. Shelo yehu shnayim sheichatim zevach echad. You don't want to have two people slaughtering a korban. And Tizbachu shelo yeh echad shochet shnei zvachim. And also you shouldn't have that one person who's slaughtering should not be slaughtering two korbanos v'mevkana tizbacheu ksiv. That it's written tizbacheu. So basically, Tizbach is singular and tizbachu, which is written tizbacheu, means to slaughter it, also singular. So you want a single person slaughtering a single animal when it comes to korbanos. Now the next Mishnah says that one who slices through two heads at once, through two necks at once, it's kosher but only b'di'evid. That's because it's talking about kodshim where you really want to have one person slicing the neck of one animal. And therefore, since the next Mishnah begins with a teaching about Kodshim, it makes sense to say that it's a continuation of the end of the previous Mishnah, which is also talking about Kodshim. Eli Omrat b'chulin, but if you say that the Sefer is talking about chulin, afilu l'chatchila nami, you can have one person slicing through two heads as long as the knife is long enough, even l'chatchila, as long as the knife is long enough and all the requirements are met. It's probably a more complicated thing to do, but if you could do it, then even l'chatchila, it is all good. So from the fact that the next Mishnah starts off with a sugya that's clearly talking about kodshim, so it makes sense that the seifa of the previous Mishnah would be talking about kodshim as well, rather than chulin. V'af Shimon ben Lakish savar reisha b'chulin v'seifa b'kodshim, and even the holy Reb Shimon ben Lakish says that the reisha is talking about chulin and that the seifa is talking about kodshim. And that the Sefer is talking about Kodshim. The Amr Reb Shimon ben Lakish says Reb Shimon ben Lakish in Masechta Yoma. That in Masechta Yoma, Reb Shimon ben Lakish says, look, our Mishnah here in Masechta Chulin, the first Mishnah in the second parak of Masechta Chulin, Me'achar sheshaninu rubo shel echad kamo. How come the Mishnah in Chulin says in the Reisha that rubo kikulo, a majority of the siman is enough? Then why in the Sefer does it repeat to say essentially that rubo kikulo? Why does it repeat the Mishnah repeat itself in the Sefer? The answer is because there's a Mishnah in Masechta Yoma that is describing the avoda of the high priest on Yom Kippur, specifically the shechita of the korban tamid shel shachar. Heviu lo es hatamid. They bring the Kohen Gadol, the Korban Tamid Shel Shachar, Kratzo. Now, interestingly, the Kohen Gadol, right, all, as we're going to see in a minute, all of the Avodah, right, I'll spill the beans. Wait, I won't spill the beans. Why? What does the Pasuk say? It quotes a Pasuk. Now I can't say. What is it? Yeah. I don't know. Maybe because there's v'chipar. Am I missing? Does it say? I don't know. Anyways, all of the avodas of Yom Kippur are done. I thought I quoted a pasuk. Anyways, all of the avodas on Yom Kippur are done by the Kohen Gadol. That means the shechita, but also the Kabbalah Sadam. So the Kohen Gadol, once he slices the neck of the Korban Tamid Shel Shachar, rove, a majority of the way, he stops so that he can quickly grab the kli to receive the blood for Kabbalah Sadam, because he's got to do everything, the shechita, Kabbalah, halacha, zrika. So he slices just the minimum amount, and then he allows another Kohen who's there to finish the slice, while he quickly gets the kli to receive the squirt of blood. So again, if you lost a tamid, they bring him the korban tamid kratzo, he slices it just the majority of the way. Umerek acher shchitaso al yado, and then another kohen who's right next to him finishes the slice, finishes the shechita, while he quickly gets the vessel to do Kabbalah Sadam. Yachol lo merek yehei pasul. Now what if the Kohen Gadol only sliced halfway and nobody then completed slicing? Would it be pasul? So Lachach Shaninu says Rish Lakish, that's why the Mishnah in Chullin says Rov Echad B'Ov Rov Shnayim B'Behema, to say it would be kosher. A majority, even by Kodshim, is sufficient. So we see that Rish Lakish also says that the Seifa of Rov Echad B'Ov Rov Shnayim B'Behema is talking about Kodshim, and that's how we know that even if the Kohen Gadol just sliced halfway and nobody else completed the slice, it would still be kosher. Right, so we had just said, the Gemara in Yoma asks, as we just said, is it possible that if no Kohen that was next to him completed the slicing, it would be possible? The Gemara says, what kind of question is that? Obviously it would be kosher, because if it would be possible, if you need somebody to finish slicing, well then that means that the Kohen Gadol didn't do a complete avoda. He needs the other Kohen to continue slicing. But if that's the case, then that means that the Kohen Gadol isn't doing all of the avoda. So, right, the Kohen Gadol needs to do all the avoda, which means that he's definitely doing enough for it to be considered kosher. What kind of question is it to ask? Maybe you need the other Kohen to do it in order for it to be kosher. Imkain, if it's not kosher, havile avoda ba'acher, then that means that somebody else is doing one of the avodas of Yom Kippur. Vitanya, kol avodas Yom Kippurim ksher einan ksheres elabo, that you need the Kohen Gadol to be doing all of the avodas. So what kind of question is that? Obviously, the Kohen Gadol is slicing enough for it to be considered kosher, even if nobody else took over. Halachikam, and this is what it's saying. Yachol yeh pasul midirabanan. Maybe midirabanan it's pasul. What we're asking is, well, maybe if the Kohen who was standing next to him did not complete the slice, would it be pasul midirabanan? You can skip the next few words. L'chach shaninu rov echad ba'ov v'rov shnayim b'beima. That is why the Seifa of the Mishnah, Masechta Chulin, says that all you need is a majority by Kodshim, and it's enough. It would not be pasul midirabanan, even if nobody continued the slice. Umei achar tafilu psula dirabanan leka lamli lemerik. Okay, so if we just said no, even if nobody continued the slice, it would be kosher lechatchila. It wouldn't even be pasul midirabanan. So then why do you need somebody b'chlal to finish the slice? Mitzvah lemarik. Well, because it's better to finish the slice, because that way the blood will come out better, and that's an important part of the korban. Givaldik. Because it's still better to slice through the whole way, so therefore, even though technically it would be completely fine without completing the slice, but nonetheless, best to have somebody slice the whole way, that we can more efficiently get out more blood. Okay, Givaldik. Okay, fine. So we answered the question of why the Mishnah states twice that you got to slice more than halfway. One for Chulin, one for Kodshim. Ratio for Chulin, safer for Kodshim. And friends, now we get to the third and final section of today's daf, when shechita begins technically. Let's jump in to understand what's going on here. Amar Reb Shimon ben Lakish says, Rish Lakish Mishum Levi Sava, in the name of Levi the older. Ein l'shchita ela basof. Rabbi Yochanan Amar yeshna l'shchita mitchila be'ad sof. Says Rish Lakish that shechita is only, it's only considered shechita at the, once the shechita is complete. We're gonna have to understand nafkamina. We're gonna start jumping into nafkaminas right away. And Rabbi Yochanan says that the shechita is considered to be like on a continuum. It begins with the beginning of the slice until the completion of the slicing. So again, Amr Rish Lakish, Mishum Levi Sava, Eina l'shchita ela basof, that shechita is at the end of the slicing. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Yeshna l'shchita mitchila v'ad sof, whereas Rabbi Yochanan says that shechita is considered, it's considered like shechita is going on throughout the slicing. Amar Rove says Rove, Hakomodim eicha d'shachat simen echad, avi kuchavim simen echad yisrael shi psula. Interesting question. What if an avi kuchavim slices through the trachea of an animal, and then a yid slices through the esophagus? You might think, well, according to Rish Lakish, who says that shechita is at the end of the shechita, so who cares that an Oved Kechavim sliced through the trachea? The shechita is only considered to be a shechita at the end. And at the end, it was a yid doing the shechita. So you might think it could be okay. Now, according to Rabbi Yochanan, who says that shechita is from the beginning of the slice until the end. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, so of course it's going to be a problem because part of the shechita, the first half of it, was done by an Oved Kechavim. That's a problem, right? The first Mishnah in Masechta Chulin says, let's see, do I have it over here? Let's see, come on. What does it say in the first Mishnah? Man, they push it out to the next Mishnah. I don't remember when the next Mishnah is. Is that like on Daf Test or something? Anyways, in the first Mishnah in the Mishnayos, we say that the shechita of a Nachri is going to be no good. Where is the next Mishnah? Is it Daf? Let me see. Come on. Mishnayos, where are you? Anything? What's this? Shechita Oved Kechavim nevela u'mitama b'masa. There you go. Daf Yud Gimel Masechta Chulin. It says that the shechita of an Oved Kechavim is nevela. So that's a problem. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, who says that shechita is throughout the slicing, well, the first part of the slicing was done by an Oved Kechavim. The shechita of, that means that part of the shechita was done by somebody whose shechita is nevela. But according to Rish Lakish, who says the shechita happens at the end of the shechita, that was done by a yid, so you might think it's okay. So again, Omar Rove says Rove, Hakol Modim, everybody agrees, even Rish Lakish, that if an Oved Kechavim sliced through one siman, v'siman echad Yisrael, and then a yid sliced through the next siman, she psula, it is nonetheless pasul sharei naise ba maise treifa biyad Oved Kechavim. Because, this is the way I understand it, that a significant maise was done by the Oved Kechavim. Oved Kechavim is pasul to do shechita, as we saw from the Mishnah Daf Yud Gimel, that shechita and Oved Kechavim is nevela, and Oved Kechavim is pasul to do shechita, and he did enough of the shechita that would make it a treifa. He sliced through the trachea. He did a significant part of the shechita. A significant part of the shechita was done by somebody who's pasul to shech. Shari naise ba maise treifa, a maise treifa, an action that would make the animal treif, was done by an Oved Kechavim. So even though a yid then took over, it's too late. The damage has been done. Ba'olas ha'of nami, and similarly, by an olas ha'of, both simanim need to be severed, and that needs to be above the chut asikra, right? Of course, the mizbeach is divided. Its height is divided in half by a red line called the chut asikra. And olas ha'of, you climb up the kevesh of the mizbeach until you get to the sovev, and that is where you would do malika for an olas ha'of. Now, but olas ha'of nami hecha dimalik siman echad limata. If below the chut hasikra he did malika on and sliced his fingernail sliced through one of the simanim, that is going to be a problem, because below the chut hasikra is pasul for an olas ha'of. So in a place that is pasul, right, just like in the first case, you have a person who is pasul. The Oved Kechavim did a significant avoda. He sliced through the trachea, making it a treifa. So here also, in a place that is puzzle, below the chuta sikra, you did something significant, which is sliced through the first, right, one of the simanim, which would be for olas ha'of, for chatas ha'of, that would be significant. It's enough to make a chatas ha'of kosher. So you did enough of an action that in the case of a chatas ha'of, it would already be considered kosher, and you did that in a place that is puzzle for an olas ha'of. So if where am I? So if he did echad the malak siman echad lamata, if he severed one of the simanim below the chuta sikra, which is a puzzle place to do that, v'siman echad lamayla, and then he climbed up the ramp of the mizbeach and severed the second siman above the chuta sikra, psula. Even Reish Lakish would say that it's puzzle. We wouldn't say, well, the malika completed in a kosher place. Sharei also ba maise chatas ha'of limata, because he did a maise chatas ha'of, something that for a chatas ha'of would be enough to make it kosher, and you did that for an olas ha'of limata, below the chuta sikra, in a place that's puzzle. So in both cases, right, of a nachri doing half the shechita or doing half of the malika below the chuta sikra for an olas ha'of, you did a significant amount of the shechita was done either by a puzzle person or in a puzzle place. Everyone's going to agree that that is problematic. However, what if a korban was slaughtered, but he started doing the shechita outside of the azara, which is shchutei chutz, but after one siman he moved the animal into the azara and completed the shechita. So you have a yid and he's doing shechita, and he slices through one of the simanim outside the azara and then moves into the azara to complete the shechita. So leman de amr yesh shechita mitchila v'ad sof michayev, according to Rabbi Yochanan, who says that the shechita begins as you begin slicing, which means that half of the shechita was done b'chutz, and that's shchutei chutz. And Rabbi Yochanan would say, well, you shechted a korban outside of the azara, you're chayav for shchutei chutz. Whereas Rish Lakish, who says that it's considered to be shechita only at the end of the shechita, well then, it was only considered shechita at the end, and he was in the azara, so he was shechted in the azara. Lo mechayev, he would not be chayav for shchutei chutz. Amalei Rabba bar Shimi. However, Rabba bar Shimi says, Mar lo amar hachi, umanu Rav Yosef. Says Rabba bar Shimi that Rav Yosef would not agree with that assessment, because heichad de shachat siman echad b'chutz v'siman echad b'fnim, because in a scenario where one siman was slaughtered, was sliced outside of the azara, and the other was sliced inside the azara, nami pasul, that would also be pasul. What's the gimel? Okay, divra kol psula. Everyone agrees psula sharei also b'maise chatas of b'chutz, because you did something that by a chatas of one siman would be considered significant, and therefore enachanami, by an animal you would have to slaughter both simanim. But since there is a context in which what he did was significant, now everyone agrees that it would be possible. Lo nechliku ella, rather, here's where they argue kigon shachat miut simanin b'chutz v'gamru b'fnim. If you sliced a minority of the way through the simanim b'chutz, so it wasn't accurate, right? You didn't complete anything b'chutz, and then you went inside and then you completed and you continued slicing until both simanim were sliced at least halfway. According to Rabbi Yochanan, you already started the shechita b'chutz, so you can be chayav for shchutei chutz. But according to Rish Lakish, who says that the shechita is only at the end, since the shechita was completed in the azara, lo michayev, you will not be chayav for shchutei chutz. Let me chap a shluck of water and we'll go weiter. Givaldik. So very interesting machlokas there between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish regarding whether shechita is considered shechita at the end. Yeshna the shechita mitchila v'ad sof. Well, that would be ein l'shechita ela basof, or yeshna l'shechita mitchila v'ad sof. Now, Masav Reb Zera asks a kasha based on a Mishnah Masechta Para. The fourth Mishnah in the fourth chapter of Masechta Para says, Kol asukin b'para mitchila v'ad sof. Anybody involved in the sreifas para aduma from the shechita until the collecting of all the ashes, the entire avoda, anybody involved, mitam begadim, they become tamei, their clothing becomes tamei. Uposin also b'malcha acheres, and when it comes to doing to the streifas paraduma, if you do any other melacha during the process of the streifas paraduma, for example, if there was a gourd growing on Har HaZeisim, and after shechting the paraduma, you then sliced the gourd and harvested it, then posted also b'melacha acheres, the shchitas paraduma, right, the streifas paraduma would be possible. Iraba psul b'shchitasa. Now, if a psul happened during the shchita, Machlekes Rashi and Tosfos, Rashi says that it became a nevela. Tosfos says that you did a different malacha while doing the shchita. But anyways, a psul happens during the shchita. You can skip the next few words. Eino metame begadim. So it won't be metame begadim, because since the shchita is the first avoda, let's even go weiter for a second. Baza also, but if after the shchita and then you do kabbalah sadam and then the dam, the blood is sprinkled 7 times towards the heichel. So if there was a psul during the hazah, which was already after the shchita, after the kabbalah, kodem psula mitama, well, anybody involved in any of the avoda before the korban became pasul during the sprinkling, so anybody who had already been involved in the avoda becomes tamei. Mitami begadim, they become tamei, their clothing becomes tamei. Le'achar psula, but anybody involved in the avoda after, once already the korban was pasul, ein mitami begadim, will not become tamei. Okay, so if mid streifas hapara it becomes pasul, so only people involved up until that point would be tamei, but not after that point. Now, we had said that this before versus after is by hazas hadam. We said though that by the, what do we say by the shechita? Iru babsul b'shchitasa, einu mitam begadim. We said that when it comes to, right, if there was a psul in the shechita, then nobody becomes tamei. But why not? The amrat yeshna is the shechita mitchila v'atsof. If it's like Rabbi Yochanan says that the shechita is on a continuum, it starts with the beginning of the slicing and the shechita continues until the completion of the slicing. Well, according to Rabbi Yochanan, liflog nami b'shchitasa. Well, there could potentially also be people who are tamei, even if the psul happened during shechita, because ira ba psul b'shchitasa kodem psula, because the person who was involved in the shechita up until the point where it became pasul, because you were slicing, and that it's already considered like you started the shechita, which is avoda of the para aduma. And then at some point it became pasul, but if you were involved in slicing up until the point where it became pasul, matame begadim, you should become tamei. La'achar psula ena matame begadim, and then from the time that the shechita became psula, from that point on nobody would become tamei. So if you say that yeshna the shechita mitchila v'ad sof, then it should also be possible to have become tamei during the shechita as well. Amar Rava says, Rava niskalkul shechita kamer. Look, you're talking about where the shechita got ruined. Shiny awesome, the gloi milson, I'm afraid to love shechita. If we're talking about where the shechita was possible, then clearly it wasn't a shechita. And if it wasn't a shechita, well then it wasn't a shechita. Okay, the whole concept of yeshna, the shechita mitchila v'ad sof, means that there's shechita. But if the shechita is possible, there isn't actually shechita, so there isn't really anything to talk about, practically speaking. Amar Rava yikashli ha kashli. But says Rava, if I had a question, it would be the following. L'manda Amar eina l'shechita ela basof. According to Rish Lakish, who says that the shechita is only at the end. Liflog be'achshera depara. Let's make a chiluk in the scenario where the shechita was done properly. Kigon de shachtua b'trei gavri. For example, if 2 people slaughtered the para aduma, they took turns. The gavra kama lo mitama, that the first person, if you have 2 people who slaughtered the para aduma, so the first person to slaughter and he didn't, right? The second person completed the slaughter. The first person did the first half of the slaughter. So according to Rish Lakish, he didn't actually, right? The shechita is at the end when the second person completes it, which means the first person technically didn't do anything. So he should be tahor. The Gavra Basar Matama, and the second person who completed the shechita, so he's the one who should be considered to have slaughtered it, and he should be tameh. So says Rish Lakish. So says Rava. If you hold yesh ein the shechita el vasof, that the shechita is at the end, you should be able to have a situation where by the shechita, some people are tahor, some people are tameh. Rav Yosef says, Rav Yosef, Trei Gavre, Bechad Zivcha, Ka'amart, well, you are talking about two people slaughtering a korban. By Mine Daud Tanina, we learned, Tizbach, as we saw earlier, Shloyu Shnaim Shochten Zevach, you don't want to have two people slaughtering a korban. Zevach Echad. Tizbachu, Shloye Echad Shochet Shnei Zvachim, we shouldn't have one person slaughtering two korbanos at one time. It says that you shouldn't have one person, rather you should have one person slaughtering one korban. So therefore you don't want to have two people slaughtering the paraduma. Amalei Abaye says Abaye Lav Itmar Allah, but one second, isn't it said about that? Amar Bar Bachana, Amar Yechanan, Zodiv Rabbi Lazar, Reb Shimon Stimta. But that's Davka, this that you're teaching about Tizbach, that you want to have one person doing the shechita, you don't want to have two people doing the shechita by a korban. That's specifically the opinion of Rabbi Lazar Reb Shimon. The Chacham say, however, you can have two people slaughtering a korban, and therefore, according to the Chachamim, you could have two people slaughtering the korban. So therefore, it's a valid question. You could have a situation where the first person slaughtering is tahor, and the second person is tameh because he completes the shechita. Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon Nami, and even according to Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, who says that you don't want to have two people, so you can have one person slaughtering the korban, slaughtering the parah aduma. Nonetheless, kigon de shachad chad gava b'shnei sudarim, the sudar kama lo mitami, v'sudar ba'asar mitami. And guess what? Even according to Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, who says you got to have one person slaughtering the parah aduma, you could still ask the question. Let's say you have a person was slaughtering the parah aduma, and he starts slaughtering it, and then his friend pulls off his, meaning, right, so Reuven's slaughtering, Shimon now comes and pulls off Reuven's hat from his head and replaces it with another hat, and then he finishes the shechita. So the first hat, right, because it's metame begadim, the first hat would be tahor, because he hadn't yet finished the shechita. The second hat would be tameh. So still you can make such a chilik. Rather, el b'psula de para kamari b'achsheret lo kamari. Look, when we're talking about by para aduma, who's going to be tahor and who's going to be tameh, we're talking about when the parah became pasul. So the people up to that point are tameh and the people after that point are tahor. We're not talking about when everything is going well and talking about, well, technically up to this point he changed his hat. No, we're not talking about when it's kosher. We're talking about when it's pasul. Friends, we're going to stop here in the middle. Shtickle cliffhanger. We're going to have to pick up in the middle tomorrow on Daf Lamed. But wow, this was some Daf. My brain is like starting to mush a little bit here at the end of this Daf, which means it was a good one. Okay, gewaldig. Friends, on Daf Chof Tes of Masechta Chulin, the first section was if and when half can be considered more than half. Very, very interesting. Initially, we had thought to say that this was a machlokes about shechita, that slicing halfway could be considered like a majority, but no. In the end, we said that that was a machlokes by Korban Pesach. Rav says that if half of Am Yisrael is Tmei Meis, it could be considered like more than half, i.e. that they would be able to offer the Korban Pesach B'tumah, whereas Rav Kana says half is not considered more than half, and they would have to wait to Pesach Sheni. We then discussed when slicing more than half is sufficient. Of course, in our Mishnah, it mentioned twice that rubo kikulo when it comes to shechita. Why twice? So we had said because the Reisha is talking about chulin and the Sefer is talking about kachim, and then we brought a whole, maybe 5 different rayas to prove that the Reisha is talking about chulin and the Sefer is talking about kachim. And finally, we discussed the machlok. We learned about the machlokes between Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan when it comes to shechita. Rish Lakish says, Ein the shechita ela levasof, that shechita is dafka at the end of the shechita, whereas Rabbi Yochanan says Yeshna the shechita mitchila va'atzov, that the shechita is considered shechita throughout, from the beginning of the slicing until the end of the slicing. There was an nafkamina. For example, if you did part of the slicing outside of the azara and completed the slicing in the azara, Rabbi Yochanan would say that you're chayiv v'shchutei chutz. Rabbi Rish Lakish would say that you'd be pater and that it would be kosher shechita since the shechita was completed in the azara. Friends, that was the Daf Chob Tes of Masechta Chullin. I hope you enjoyed. Have a great, 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 great day.